Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is Kimberly Tyson. I'm the Marketing and Program Director for the Embryo Adoption Awareness Center and Nightlight Christian Adoptions. This morning, we're very pleased to bring you Exploring the Cost of Embryo Adoption. Okay, next slide, please. Our presenter today will be Ms. Alyssa Trammell-McDonald. As the team leader for one of the largest embryo adoption agencies, Alyssa interacts with both donating and adopting families on a daily basis, and she is quite familiar with the cost associated with providing embryo adoption services. Alyssa is also highly regarded by the fertility clinic professionals with whom she is also in regular communications. She is counted among the few experts on embryo adoption, not only in the United States, but around the globe. Thanks for being with us today, Alyssa. Now for a little bit of housekeeping. During the presentation, all participants will be in a listen-only mode. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation using the questions you submit through our Q&A feature. You may submit your questions at any time during the session, and I would like to emphasize that you can submit them at any time instead of waiting till the end, and we will answer as many as possible at the end of Alyssa's presentation. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A panel in the lower hand portion of your screen, that right-hand lower portion of your screen. Type in your question into that dialog box and click the send button. If you happen to be in the full screen mode, you can click on the question mark icon and that will open up the Q&A panel on your screen. When you submit a question, it will be visible to all the panelists, but not only visible to you, not to all the other attendees. We expect the presentation to last about 45 minutes today, with 15 minutes for Q&A. Might be a little shorter than that, so we can give you some time back in your day. We will be distributing a copy of today's presentation and a comprehensive list to all the answers to all of the questions that you asked. We will have answers, and we will submit that out to you as well. As a reminder, this presentation is being recorded today, and with that, I will turn it over to Alyssa. Alyssa, welcome. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Kimberly. Thanks so much for having me. I'm very excited for this webinar because that's one of the most common questions we get is why is it so much or why is it so little, depending on the family's past experiences. So starting right off, the reason this comes up so many times and the cost is such a major question for families is because families facing infertility and exploring their family building options are not only facing emotional difficulties, but also financial hurdles as different doctor's appointments and different fees start to add up over time. Next slide, please. So as couples learn of their infertility diagnosis or simply just explore this option for building their families for a variety of other reasons, they may look into different treatment options. One of the most common is IVF, infertility treatments, potentially using donor gametes, which the cost for which can add up fairly quickly, or they may also explore traditional forms of adoption for building their family. Of these types of adoption, they may look at domestic infant adoption. They may look at international adoption or foster care to adoption. All of these have varying fees with them, foster adoption obviously being the cheapest, but domestic and international normally typically starting around the $20,000 mark. A newer option that more people are becoming aware of that we're speaking to specifically today is embryo donation and adoption, which typically has a much lower fee associated with it than other IVF or fertility treatments or other forms of adoption. Next slide, please. So to be clear, just to clear the air, one of the most common questions I get is, how much is it going to cost me per embryo? Just to be abundantly clear, the American Society for Reproductive Medicine has declared flatly that selling of embryos per se is ethically unacceptable. So any program that a family does choose to work with, whether that be a fertility clinic, whether that be an embryo adoption program such as the National Embryo Donation Center or Snowflake's embryo adoption, or even online resources for matching up with donors yourself, all of those programs are not charging per embryo. You're not paying for the embryos themselves. You are typically paying a fee for the services delivered associated with the matching process and the donation process, not for the embryos themselves. So what does this cover? Embryo adoption includes a medical procedure and counseling services for donors and adopters, matching and administration costs of facilitating these matches, the legal contracts that transfer over ownership of the embryos from the donor family to the recipient family, making sure that the donated embryos are meeting FDA compliance guidelines by having the donor families complete additional screening and blood work. It also involves working with the fertility clinics involved. Beyond that, it can also include shipping if the recipient family is working with a different fertility clinic than the donor family, so there's a cost associated with transporting the embryos from the donor family's clinic to the recipient family's clinic. It also can include ongoing family communications if the families choose to have an open relationship with each other between the donor and the recipient family. Also, it can include permanent record storage depending on the agency or the program that you're working with. Depending on their protocol, the records will be stored for a set amount of time, and other expenses that may come up along the way unexpectedly. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we get is the cost of embryo adoption really affordable when compared with other options? Next slide, please. Here's a comparison chart just to help put things in perspective as far as where embryo adoption using an agency falls on the spectrum of different fertility treatment options. When you look at it compared to other options, while the ballpark range of $12,000 to $16,000 total for embryo adoption through an agency may seem steep, when compared with other options for family building, it does actually fall on the more affordable side, especially considering that it allows you to actually experience a pregnancy. So just some points of comparison. We have U.S. foster adoption on the lowest end of the spectrum. It is the most financially prudent option of all of the family building options, but with that, it is the most uncertain. Depending on the state you live in, they may have varying value on reunification, meaning that the odds of the child being placed back with their biological family may be much higher. That's something that you're not going to encounter with international adoption or IVF, egg donation, embryo adoption. So that is why the costs for that are significantly lower, because there is a higher risk associated with it as well. Next up, we have embryo donation through a fertility clinic. So this is where it's handled by a fertility clinic. They will handle the legal contracts and the donor screening. It is less expensive than an agency adoption because typically the involvement ends at the medical side of things, whereas the adoption agencies are also applying best practices of adoption to the process, in addition to helping the family connect with a clinic and navigate the medical side of things as well. Next up from that, we have egg donation. This is an option that's appealing to many families as they consider their options and they want to experience pregnancy themselves. However, the cost for that can bring the cost up exponentially from what they would have been paying just for an anonymous donation through their clinic. After that, we have IVF procedures. Those also vary widely. One of the factors in that can even be the location of your fertility clinic. We've found that services are more expensive in major metropolitan areas, as are pretty much every other service, including gasoline, food, and just general cost of living. So we see that translate over to cost with fertility clinics as well.
Alyssa, this is Kimberly. I'd just like to interject that when you're going to be using egg donation, you're really using egg donation in conjunction with IVF. So those two costs kind of merge together, right?
That's a good point. Because you may be paying an egg donation agency separately for the donor oocytes in addition to your clinic's IVF fees. So that's a very good point, that those typically stack on top of each other if you're doing egg donation as well. After that, we have domestic infant adoption, and then followed where you adopt a newborn in the United States, followed by international adoption, which may be a younger child or an older child, depending on which country you adopt from and which program you utilize. And then on the higher end of the spectrum, we have surrogacy. So that would be the IVF procedure costs plus the expenses of paying a gestational carrier. Next slide, please. So what makes an embryo adoption program different than an embryo donation program with a fertility clinic? Because we see those two costs are somewhat close to each other and both are on the lower end of the cost spectrum. Next slide, please. The main goal of a fertility clinic is to help their patients achieve pregnancy and have a baby, and they are amazing at what they do. They will walk with you through that process and do everything they can within their power to help you achieve a successful pregnancy. Next slide, please. However, on that note, the children born from anonymously donated embryos are born into a beautifully unique family situation. they will be raised as the children of parents to whom they are not genetically related. And this is the foundational element of adoption, is a child being raised as the child of parents that they are not genetically related to. Next slide, please. So with this in mind, a fertility clinic is dedicated to providing outstanding medical care. They focus on the medical procedure, they focus on a successful frozen embryo transfer, and they do this with great skill. Next slide, please. But again, the treatment typically does stop there, as they are a medical facility, and their range of expertise is through that process. Whereas an adoption agency will typically pick up and then say, okay, what next after that? We will help you find a fertility clinic and walk you through that, but then we will also be there as lifelong support as your child grows and is raised and may have questions about their origin. So embryo adoption agencies help the children successfully be placed into permanent families and provide ongoing care for that process. Independent adoption research does confirm that secrecy and anonymity will negatively impact a child's future success. So adoption agencies come from the perspective that people do deserve to know their origins. One of the best practices of adoptions, they are applied to the placement of embryos, because adopting an embryo is more than a medical procedure. It's about bringing about the birth of a baby who will grow into a child with many questions. So speaking to that note of research on anonymity, over the years, we've taken, and other adoption agencies doing embryo adoption programs have taken the knowledge they've learned from over 50 years of adoption with infants in the United States and applied those same best practices to embryo adoption. And what we've seen over time is children who do not have access to any information about their genetic family or their genetic origins will oftentimes begin a searching process of, okay, well, where do I come from? And they have so many unanswered questions. When I look in the mirror, whose nose do I have? Or, wow, I'm really good at violin and nobody else in my family is. I wonder if that's genetic. And we have found that by having an open relationship with the genetic family and having those questions answered, that child can have a much more firm sense of their identity and their history and have answers to those questions rather than feeling like they're constantly trying to fill in the pieces themselves. Instead, we make sure that they do have those answers and they do have that information as they're moving forward and growing into adulthood. Next slide, please. So agencies that choose to apply the adoption model based on these years of experience, based on what's best for the child and also what's best for the adopting parents, the donor parents, and their children. So another part of the puzzle is beyond the children that are conceived using donor embryos, there is the adoptive family, who they may want to have access to more medical information. Say the child is diagnosed with something down the road. By having an open relationship and by having an agency help mediate that relationship, the adoptive family can reach out to the genetic family for more information as it becomes necessary. And for the donor parents, it can be incredibly helpful going through an agency rather than an anonymous clinic donation program, because they know that along with the permanent storage of records and mediation of contact, most embryo adoption agencies also require that their family complete a home study, which is a very in-depth process, typically taking several months, mainly built on educating family on raising children not genetically related to themselves, but it also has a screening component as well, where the family completes detailed background checks and meets with a social worker multiple times. This can give the genetic family peace of mind, knowing that this family has gone through very in-depth screening before even being eligible to adopt embryos. It also can be helpful for them having the option of an open relationship, because they are getting to screen the adoptive family themselves and be involved in the matching process and ultimately choose whether or not to move forward with the match. And then finally, beyond that, the other piece that most people don't think about is the full genetic siblings of children born through adopted embryos. So typically the couples placing through an agency will have gone through their own IVF procedure, had children of their own, and then chosen to place the remaining embryos. So it can be a great opportunity for the genetic siblings to get to know one another and have contact with each other, and or even if they don't have contact, just to have an awareness of each other. It sounds somewhat crass, but one of the more common comments we get is, hey, do you store their names permanently? So just in case we can make sure our kids don't grow up and date each other. So yes, there is that storage of information, and it's also the option for the genetic family's children to know of any full siblings they may have out there. Next slide, please. So we've talked a lot about the ongoing communication. We've talked a lot about best practices of adoption, but let's get into the very specific details of what does this agency fee provide me. If we see that agencies are charging more than a fertility clinic, what does that extra money go towards? Next slide, please. Typically, this is what it covers. It may vary slightly depending on which agency or which organization you go through, but that range we saw of $12,000 to $16,000 total, including the frozen embryo transfer fee, typically is going towards these things. Human resources and administrative costs. There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes that our families don't see. By helping our families get ready to enter the process, processing their paperwork, reviewing their home studies, and details like that. It also covers ongoing counseling for both the donor and the adopting family. We, as an agency, are there for them and will help walk them through the process and help them make the decision that's right for them. Not all families will choose to move forward with the process, but it's our job to help them process through that and really decide if this is a good fit for building their family. It also includes the FDA or clinic-required donor-parent screening. So this would include the updated infectious disease screening that donor families are required to complete. It also would cover any costs associated with that, blood draw fees and things like that, and also helping the family complete their FDA-required physical and risk assessment questionnaire. Beyond that, it goes into the matching of the adopting family with a donating family, which is an inherently time-consuming effort depending on how the agency chooses to handle the matching process. If they are applying an adoption model to it, where the adopting family is first selected by the genetic or donating family, and then the adoptive family has the chance to review the genetic or donor family's information and then decide whether or not to move forward, that can be a very lengthy and detailed process. I help oversee the matching process in the Snowflakes program, and for us, that involves me hand going through each of our available genetic families when I have an adoptive family ready for a match, and selecting them based off of the criteria that both the adopting family and the genetic family have set for their embryos. One of the questions we get is, oh, do you have a computer algorithm where you just plug in our preferences and then it spits out a couple of matches for us? But in our program, at least, we do not. That would make it a lot shorter, certainly, but we go through and I read the family's profile. I get to know them, their preferences, their lifestyle, and then look at the preferences that they have given us and look for a genetic family that seems to be a suitable match and for whom the adoptive family fits the genetic family's preferences as well. And so as you can imagine, reading the family profiles and going through each match and reviewing numerous potential matches is a very time-consuming process to help get that match that both families are comfortable with. Once the match has been made and everybody has said yes, then begins the coordination between multiple clinics. If the adoptive family is working with a different fertility clinic than the donor family is, there is a lot of back and forth making sure that the recipient clinic has all of the information that they need on the embryos prior to accepting them. So that information includes sending along the embryology reports, any details on the embryos, letting the recipient clinic know what freezing protocol was used on the embryos, so that way they make sure to have the materials on hand necessary for the frozen embryo transfer, and also making sure that we have met their clinic requirements and presented them the information in a form that they're comfortable with. Once we've gotten the green light from the clinic on that front, then we begin the legal preparation of contracts and all other paperwork. So agencies do include the legal part of the process, which legally transfers over responsibility of the embryos from the genetic family to the adoptive family. And though in this presentation we are using the word adoption, it is important to note that it is different from a legal perspective. It is actually considered a property donation, and so those contracts are property contracts that are being drawn up by the agency, transferring responsibility from the donor family to the adoptive family. Typically, those contracts will also include a portion about ongoing communication. So if the family is utilizing an agency that offers ongoing communication coordination as a part of their services, then this contract will also include what the expectations are between the genetic family and the adoptive family should any children be born from the embryos. So this will include speaking with the families and coming up with a plan that they're both comfortable with. From personal experience, the option that most families settle on is having agency-mediated contact, where the adoptive family will send updates on any children born at a minimum of once per year. So that way the genetic family is getting an update on any children born, they are seeing pictures, and then they can send updates on their children back to the adoptive family as well. After the legal contracts are taken care of and signed and returned, then there's the management and coordination involved with shipping the embryos. So that's the part where we begin working with both clinics, the sending clinic and the recipient clinic, to make sure the sending clinic has all of the release forms on their end and they're legally cleared to release the embryos, making sure the recipient clinic has all of the documentation they need in order to accept the embryos, and then working with the embryologist to set up a transport date that works for them. Part of that process typically includes coordinating and procuring a tank to transport the embryos. Depending on the agency you're working with, they may have their own tank or their own tank rental company, or the clinic may help you set that up as well if the clinic has their own tank that they're comfortable with using. Beyond that is after the embryos have shipped and the family has had their transfer, there's the facilitation of communication between donating and adopting families for 18 or more years. So it is important to look into what the agencies offer as far as ongoing communication coordination. Some of them will cap it at different ages of the child. Others will offer indefinite communication coordination, meaning forwarding messages along for the families. So that way, if the families are not quite comfortable with exchanging direct contact information, they can send an email to the agency that will then be forwarded to the other family and vice versa. Finally, the other thing is permanent record storage. So coming through the snowflakes, for example, every record is kept indefinitely. As an adoption agency, we value keeping this information permanently stored, and so these records will stay stored with our agency for ongoing reference. So if the family does need to reach out to the genetic family for a medical emergency, we keep their contact information on file and make sure that we can reach out to them if necessary. Next slide, please. Other expenses to also consider is the adoption home study, which I referenced, that in-depth screening process where they're meeting with a social worker and also completing educational components. That can be $1,500 to $3,000 depending on the agency and the part of the country you're located in. It includes the frozen embryo transfer, which will be in addition to what an agency is charging. So that can range from $2,500 to $6,000 for the frozen embryo transfer procedure with the fertility clinic, and then also ongoing embryo storage fees. So if the family has adopted embryos, has a transfer, becomes pregnant, but then wants to keep the embryos for future family building efforts, it is worth noting that you would be responsible for ongoing storage fees with your clinic to keep those frozen embryos stored there until you choose to use them. Those fees are included in the flow chart that we gave of the costs of agency embryo adoption. Those were lumped in with that $12,000 to $16,000 estimation that we gave. So the agency fees themselves may be $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, depending on the agency, plus these additional ones, which get you up to that $12,000 to $16,000 range that we gave earlier on in the presentation. Next slide, please. One of the misconceptions we do want to address in this is the number of frozen embryos. So you've probably heard by now the number 600,000 frozen embryos in storage, although at this point in time they're estimating that it's actually closer to 1 million frozen embryos currently in storage in the United States. That can seem like an awful lot, and I've had families say, well, you've got 600,000, surely, you know, how much is it just for one? Next slide, please. But that's just the very beginning of the story. Those 600,000 to 1 million frozen embryos may be designated for future use by the family that originally created them. The family may just choose to store them indefinitely rather than place them for donation or adoption, or they may be donated to research. So those are embryos that are essentially in limbo in the United States, and it will be a much smaller portion of those 600,000 to 1 million embryos that the genetic or donor family will make available for placement with a recipient family. So as we've mentioned several times throughout this presentation, it is the view of agencies that embryo adoption is not simply a medical procedure. And fertility clinics do recognize this. They do require a psychological evaluation for the recipient couples of donated embryos, but that is typically a one-time meeting with a psychologist and does not go into the years of service afterwards as well. So, another key difference between that is agencies, unlike many clinic programs, do have donated embryos available for placement now. So families with remaining embryos may choose embryo adoption because they wish to be involved in choosing the recipient family, and they also want to know the outcome and know if there were any children born from that. So that's not always a constant question in the back of their heads of, wow, I wonder how that went if they chose to donate anonymously through a clinic. So these agencies are counseling donors on what the best option is for them. We tell every family that calls our program, you know what, we're not the right fit for everybody. Different programs have different perks, and it's about finding the one that's the best fit for you. But because of an open adoption model, typically agencies that offer that do have a larger supply of families choosing to donate their embryos, whereas fertility clinics may have a smaller number of families donating their embryos anonymously, so there may be a wait list associated with receiving anonymously donated embryos through a fertility clinic, whereas through an agency, depending on your circumstances, there may be details that may make it harder to find a match based off of your preferences, but typically there is not a line for receiving donated embryos through an agency. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, just reiterating what these services include through an agency, managing the inquiries from both genetic and adopting families. A lot of the work actually goes into the process before any of our families even apply because, as I said, each agency and each clinic program is different, and we recognize that there is no one-size-fits-all for these. So we help walk families through the decision of what's the best fit for them, and I know other agencies do that as well through their application and screening process. There's the coordinating of the application, finding a match that suits the needs and requirements for all parties involved. Since we are treating it like an adoption, it means meeting the preferences of the adoptive family, meeting the preferences of the genetic family, and meeting the preferences of the family's clinic, because although we are adding adoption practices to it, we do recognize that your clinic also has a duty to do their best and treat this as a medical procedure and look out for their clients in the midst of that. So that means not only are we meeting the adoptive family's preferences for the embryos, but we're also touching base with their clinic and asking, do you have any preferences for the embryos? Is there any extra screening they need to go through? Do you care how they were frozen or how long they were frozen, or how many there are, what stage they were frozen at? So we are coordinating all of those details. Also ensuring the legal provisions by taking care of the contract and counseling the families on that process. Managing the transfer of medical records from the donor family's clinic to the recipient family's clinic, and then ongoing counseling for both donors and adopters. Next slide, please. So families choosing to grow their family through embryo donation or adoption face the decision of why would they choose to work with an agency and not a clinic. As we mentioned, there is the availability of donor embryos. It is a good idea, whatever agency or clinic that you are choosing to work with or exploring working with, to just ask them what their average wait time is to be matched, because different agencies and different clinics will have different answers for that, so it's important to ask what their availability of donor embryos looks like currently. Also, we provide a mutually agreeable family match, meaning the donor family is involved in the process, the adoptive family is involved, and the clinic is involved. Also, finally, there is the established communications coordination and permanent record storage. I know our fertility clinics we work with are incredibly busy offering the best service they can to their families and making sure they see them through the medical procedures and they see them through that process. And that does not leave a lot of time for forwarding emails and Christmas cards and helping navigate those waters. So an agency can help you work through that part of the process. Next slide, please. So that brings us back to the question that many of you have front and center as you make decisions, which is, why do some agency programs seem more expensive than others? I'm coming at it from the background of working with snowflakes, but there's other major agencies in the United States that offer services very similar to ours. So why does it seem like some of them are much more expensive? Next slide, please. as you consider which agency is the best fit for you, it's very important to make sure that you are comparing apples to apples. So some agency programs have developed fee structures that are very different than one another. Some are all-inclusive and some are a la carte. So what that means is some programs will charge just a flat rate, regardless of what your process looks like. So the Snowflakes program, for example, offers a flat rate for agencies fees. It is $8,000. That will not go up. That is it. That's all you're paying to us. And that covers the entire process that we've gone over a few times now: matching, legal coordination, embryo transport to your fertility clinic, ongoing communication. Where other clinics and other donation programs, have taken an a la carte approach. So for example, the National Embryo Donation Center offers their fees based off of what specifically you're looking for. So it may start out at a lower base fee, but then if you would like ongoing communication, that's an additional fee. If you'd like to adopt the full sibling set of embryos, that's an additional fee, rather than just one flat rate with all of that included. Next slide, please. So that can bring up the question as you look at what agencies are doing and what they're handling for you and what those fees are associated with it. It can bring up the question of, well, that seems easy enough. Why don't I just do it myself? Next slide, please. You technically can. There are self-matching websites allowing couples to meet and arrange things themselves. So there are websites where families can post that they have embryos available, and then recipient families can go on hoping to find a donor family to be matched with. So this would all be self-handled on these websites. With that, you can do a directed donation with a friend or a family member as well. So if you happen to know somebody personally who has remaining embryos and they are comfortable with you receiving them, you can also make those arrangements yourself for the process. Next slide, please. Some words of caution, just because we do occasionally get the calls from families who have tried to coordinate it themselves and then just run into multiple roadblocks along the way. It's just very important to make sure that you take all of the factors into consideration as you look into this option as well. It can be somewhat risky, and once you start including all the costs, it doesn't always work out to be cheaper. So even though it may not cost anything for the matching service, or maybe a nominal fee to find each other through this website, you would still be responsible for other parts of the process that may be more cost intensive. Another thing to take into account is that there's no vetting process for placing or adopting families when you choose to do this yourself. So the donor family may fall through, or it may turn out that the recipient family hasn't gone through a screening process. They haven't done the background check. So you don't have that guarantee that they've been screened and that a social worker has found them to be in a good spot to begin their family. As I mentioned, you also do need to pay for all of the services separately. So if you do find a match yourself, you are still going to want to contact a reproductive attorney and make sure that they draw up a contract for you, clearly stating that you are taking responsibility for the embryos and any children born from the embryos are legally your children. Even if you know them and it's a family donation, you still want that in place just as a safety net and just also for both families' sake, so the expectations are very clear from the get-go. So that can be an added expense. The donor may also choose to require reimbursement for embryo storage or IVF costs. So if you're finding a match yourself through a website or through a friend or family member, they may ask you to help them out because they said, okay, you know what, we've invested tens of thousands of dollars in our own IVF process, and then we've been storing our embryos for the last 3 to 5 years. Can you help us pay those back storage fees? So that may be the donor's request if you're matched with them. Also, the FDA and clinic donor screening would be an added expense to you. So the updated lab work that family will have to do to donate their embryos to you, that can be several $100s, and any other screening that your fertility clinic may require to perform the embryo transfer with those embryos. Also, a thing to keep in mind is future communication commitments. If you are finding the match yourself, you will not have the option of having an agency mediate it. So that means you need to be comfortable with sharing your contact information directly and coming up with a plan of what you both are comfortable with as far as ongoing communication. On top of that, you would also be responsible for the expenses of getting the embryos from the fertility clinic where they were created to the fertility clinic that you're working with. You may also choose to travel to that fertility clinic, but that can be an added expense as well. So with this, we always tell families you can do it, you're welcome to try, but we just want to make sure that you're taking all of these into considerations before starting down that road, just so you can have a really good and realistic awareness of what it's going to take as far as money and also time to help put this process through. Next slide, please. So again, program fees, if we do choose to pay an agency, what is that agency doing with them? Next slide, please. Agencies honestly are not in the business for money. It is not a great way to make money. Most agencies are nonprofits with their 501c3 nonprofit status, meaning we're really good at not making money. All that means is you are just paying for the services that are offered to you. It's covering the man hours that goes into the matching process. It keeps the lights on in our office so we can get on our computer and email you updates along the way. It's covering those blood tests. It's covering the clinic coordination. It's covering the transport of the embryos. And then another thing that also may not come to mind immediately is it's covering client outreach. We are able to serve as many genetic and adoptive families as we do because of advertising, because of reaching out to fertility clinics, because of reaching out to OBGYNs and letting them know that this is an option available for their patients. And that also takes time and money in order to expand our reach and make more people aware of embryo adoption and donation as an option for family building. Typically, agencies are staffed by people who are passionate about adoption and serving families. I have never met a social worker in my life who got into it for the money, and if they did, they were woefully misled. I know all of us are very much in it for wanting to help families and wanting to serve them as they walk through this process. Next slide, please. So with that in mind, since you know a little bit of the ethos of agencies behind this process, now that you know what the money goes to, you may still say, okay, well, that all seems good and worth it, but that's still a lot of money to pay up front. There are different options available to you towards funding your embryo adoption. You're welcome to apply for the adoption tax credit. So if you finalize an adoption, you are able to receive, I forget the exact amount now, it's over $10,000 of an adoption tax credit. It's not likely. We get questions about this every year around tax time, so this is a very pertinent question right now. Some families have received the tax credit, but other families have not. We always advise families to talk to their CPA. We don't want you to wind up getting audited or anything like that, but talk to your CPA and see if they would recommend it. Some families have claimed that tax credit in the past with no penalty. Also, another major thing to consider is adoption benefits from employers. So many employers or companies, aside from the tax credit, will offer their own set of benefits for families pursuing adoption. We have had much more success with families receiving this benefit than families receiving the general tax write-off for it. So it would be worth talking to your employer. Snowflake's and I'm sure other agencies as well would be willing to give you written permission that you did complete an adoption or an embryo adoption which met the requirements and the best practices of adoption, and provide that to your employer if they have any further questions. I have written many letters like that and helped many families receive those benefits. Another option is crowdfunding. So there are various websites, I'm sure we have all heard of GoFundMe and other popular sites for crowdfunding. All that is you make a page, you let friends and families know, hey, we're doing this fundraising for this part of the process. Chip in a little bit if you can. So there's those websites which do typically charge a percentage of the amount donated. There's also Adoption Bridge, which is specifically for adoption crowdfunding. It was a website started by Nightlight Christian Adoptions where you can post your profile and do all of your fundraising there. Also, another option worth considering is program grants. Different agencies may have different policies on their scholarships, but it's always worth asking if they have any grants or scholarships available for families interested in embryo adoption and seeing if you'd be able to receive any financial assistance in that way as well. Next slide, please. So with all of that in mind, not only is embryo adoption an amazing way to bring a baby into your life, it is an affordable option when compared with the other options of family building when you take into consideration the services being offered and then also different options for crowdfunding and helping you raise these funds to grow your family. Next slide, please. So we do have a list of embryo adoption organizations available at embryoadoption.org. You can go ahead and contact them directly for fee schedules and see how the expenses compare to one another and see which program is the best fit for you based off of what you're hoping for from your embryo adoption. We always encourage families to not be afraid to ask questions. We want to make sure that we are serving you as best possible, and that means addressing all of your concerns from the get-go. So don't be afraid to ask questions. It is a unique process as it is, so you're probably not going to ask us a question that's more out there than anything we've heard before. We love taking questions and helping families work through the decision process and really guiding them towards whatever program is the best fit for them and their family. Next slide, please. So with that, your due diligence of exploring these options will connect you with the agency that you believe will provide you with the best services for your family and your situations. And hopefully with that, once you connect with the right agency or program, then you will get to experience the joy of family building through embryo adoption. Next slide. All right, and that concludes our talk.
Alyssa, thank you so much. Allison, will you go back to that last slide while I invite people to submit their questions? Go back a slide. Yeah, thank you. I just was making some notes and observations while Alyssa was talking, and she talked a lot about the matching process that embryo adoption agencies provide to families. I know that I have spoken to many families that have gone through this matching process, and the common thread of communication that we hear from them is, we are so amazed by the match that was made for us. It's like a match made in heaven. They're always very pleased with the process and the diligence that goes behind that process of trying to meet the preferences of the donor family, who is much like a birth mother placing with a family. That's the way we as agencies like to look at that. And then also looking at the preferences of the adopting family as well. We're never forcing any matches between donors and adopters. And I can say with confidence that the matches that are made are frequently very well accepted and very pleasing to the families involved. Regarding those over 600,000 embryos in frozen storage, yes, the majority of those embryos are being held for use by the people who had them created, because if we just think about this for a moment, if somebody gets pregnant on their fresh IVF cycle and they have embryos remaining in storage, well, they're going to have their baby 9 months later. Most people don't get pregnant right away after they have their baby. They wait a while. They wait till the baby's 1.5 years, 2 years old, and then they come back and use some more of their embryos. So it can take several years before the family who created those embryos is done using those embryos. So the majority of the embryos in frozen storage are for the people who created them. But there are also a large percentage of these embryos that are now abandoned because people decided they couldn't decide what to do with them. They didn't want to use them themselves. They didn't want to donate them to science. They weren't aware that they could choose a family to donate them to, so they didn't want to donate them anonymously for reproduction. So a lot of times people walk away from their storage of their embryos, which is a sad thing. Research has shown that families, on average, 6 to 8% of these embryos will be donated for scientific research. 6 to 8% of these embryos will be donated for reproduction. The thing to also remember about clinic donation programs is that they are normally self-contained, and clinic is receiving donated embryos from patients of that clinic, so that kind of limits their ability to have donated embryos on hand. And the patients that they're going to allow to use their embryo donation program are patients of the clinic. And that's where the waiting time can expand, because it's this self-contained program, so there aren't embryos coming in from all over the country. In fact, all over the world. So embryo adoption programs are talking to families who have embryos in a lot of places and are working with clinics all over the country. So they have the ability to receive more embryos into their program and thus have more embryos available for people interested in receiving them. The other thing I wanted to say about communication between families is that while families may start out with just having mediated communication by the agency, what we also find is that over time, their communications with one another start to open up and expand. And frequently we have families that are interacting directly with one another. Certainly we have families that have met one another face-to-face, communicate with one another regularly, either by phone or email, set up Facebook accounts and private websites and things of that nature as well. Let's see. Do we have some questions coming in? We do. And so before we get into the questions, Allison, why don't you go to that last screen? And I want to tell you about some upcoming webinars that we have. On April 27th, we are going to have 15 things you need to know about your embryo adoption profile. The profile is created both by donors and adopters, and it's really just telling the other about themselves and who they are and what their hopes are for their remaining embryos, what their hopes are for any children that they could potentially have. This is a very important document that we use in the matching process. So that webinar is coming up on the 27th. And then in May, we have Hard-Earned Lessons, a comparison of adoption and donor conception. And we're going to be looking at the history of donor conception, and our presenter for that, I believe, is Chris Probasco. You won't want to miss that. So you can sign up for all of these webinars at embryoadoption.org. And if you're interested in getting CEU credit, you can learn more about getting that on the website there. So let's turn our attention to some of our questions that we have here, Alyssa.
Yes.
Yes. Can you see them there?
Yes. Okay. So I've got one question. First question is, do you know the average cost to transfer an embryo? So that would be the frozen embryo transfer fee with the fertility clinic. And that cost will vary by several $1,000s depending on the clinic. So it's worth calling clinics in your areas and asking them for their specific fees. Typically, it's $2,500 up to $6,000. That is for the process of preparing your body for the frozen embryo transfer, the medications you'll need to take in advance to prepare your body, the screening process ahead of time just to make sure everything's going well, and then for the transfer itself.
Okay, great. Do you see this next question?
Yes. Do you have any statistics on how often the embryo transfer does not work? How many tries does it take to be successful? We do have averages on how successful it is. Typically, the success rate is the same as IVF statistics, so it's a 40% success rate per transfer that it will result in pregnancy. As far as how many tries does it take to be successful, I'm always hesitant to answer that question because there's so many variables beyond the embryos themselves in that process. So you can look at the 40% rate and say, well, okay, by simple math, that would suggest 3 transfers for success. But there are so many variables, your health history, your body, the embryos, the clinic you're working with, that we do hesitate to guarantee success for that just because there are so many different factors. But like I said, on average, each transfer has a 40% success rate.
And there's a question here that's, what is the difference between the record storage between a clinic and potentially an agency? And I would say that a fertility clinic is a medical facility, and by law, I think on average, they have to keep medical records for, I believe it's 7 years, kind of like keeping your tax papers. But with adoption agency, it actually is the law of most states in the country that adoption agencies maintain permanent record storage. And of course, with embryo adoption, we are following the best practice of adoption, and so we are maintaining a permanent record storage of these matches that are made between families. And I think that's a pretty significant positive thing about embryo adoption as well. So that was a really good question. Thank you for that one.
Another note about that is, as Kimberly mentioned, the clinic is storing medical records. The agency is also storing not only the information on the embryos that we have, but also the communication records. So every time that information is forwarded back and forth, we keep record of that. So that can be helpful with the ongoing communication process where with just saying, oh, okay, no, we know we sent this update along to this family on this date. We do keep written record of that, and we also keep contact information of the other family. So if that family has chosen to make themselves available for ongoing contact, we have a means of reaching out to them through their information. We also have them list emergency contacts and ask them to keep us updated every time they move or change their information as well. So we are storing that information, which would not be a part of your medical file if you utilize an anonymous donor through your clinic.
Right, and that word anonymous just also brings to mind for me, Alyssa, the really significant difference between an agency program and a clinic program is this idea of anonymity. So when you're donating your embryos through a clinic, you're usually doing that anonymously, and the ramifications of that are far stretched before you. So as an anonymous donor, you will not know if any children have been born as a result of your donation. You will not know which families receive embryos from your donation. In an adoption program like Snowflakes, if you donate 5 embryos, we're going to allow the family you choose to receive all 5 of those embryos, giving them the potential opportunity of having genetic siblings. In a clinic program, those 5 embryos may very well be divided up between multiple patient families that are on the waiting list at the clinic because they're trying to serve the needs of those patients. So patients within a clinic may not even know that they're receiving full genetic sibling embryos of the original donor, and they're not going to know about children that are born to them as well. So I think this whole idea of the spread of genetics into children all over the country is a really positive thing about embryo adoption, in that we know where the genetics are and we know where the children that are full genetic siblings are located. I'm not seeing any other questions come in right now. Does anybody else see questions? Sometimes that happens with WebEx. People see questions that I don't. No, Alyssa?
No,
Allison?
I'm not seeing any.
No? Okay, great. Well, with that, we are so thankful that you have joined us today. I hope you will join us in the future for another Embryo Adoption Awareness Center webinar. Thank you again, Alyssa, for sharing your expertise with us, and I hope everyone has a fantastic spring day.